Welcome to the Multiverse. Or as I, R.C. Bray, call it, Dumbass Dean's Delusion Day. Kinda rolls off the tongue, don't you think? And you gotta love the alliteration. Anyway, where was I? Oh, welcome to the Multiverse. The serialized hour or more show where author Dean M. Cole reads to you from his award-winning science fiction novels. Like I said, delusional. It was the incredible Julia Whalen and me, the incomparable R.C. Mother Effin' Bray, who won the award. Dean's writing had almost nothing to do with it. It's drivel, I tell you. Okay, it's pretty good. Actually, it's brilliant, but if you tell Dean I said that, I'll deny every word. Now, it's on to the show, where delusional Dean pretends he knows how to read, or as I like to call it, the world's best advertising for professional narration.
Hello, my co-pilots. It's author Dean M. Cole. Welcome to episode 1 of The Multiverse. As R.C. Bray said, it's a serialized show where I read chapters from my books. I'll try to release a new episode every few days, so be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get notified when I release new episodes. As R.C. Bray also said, I'm not a professional narrator. I do some accents, but they suck. Hopefully they're more funny than distracting. However, if you'd rather listen to a professional, click here for the R.C. Bray narration of today's book, Magnitude. A link to the audiobook will also be in the description. Now it's on to the show. This is part 1 of Magnitude. The story picks up a few months after the end of Amplitude. It includes all of your favorite characters, but the story starts with a couple of special operators who are based at the Super Collider facility in Geneva, Switzerland. That's it. Enjoy the show and try not to laugh too hard at my accents. Magnitude, Dimension Space, Book 4. Part 1, Chapter 1. Don't think I've ever felt this unwanted, Sergeant Leo Baker said, staring back at the pair of scientists who were scowling at them from a cafeteria table. The sergeant slid his tray farther down the railing and shook his head. Half these blokes act as if we pissed in their post-toasties. Craig smiled inwardly. After sliding his tray farther down the railing, he helped himself to a double serving of peach cobbler. I don't know about you Aussies, but as a Scottish Staff Sergeant in Her Majesty's Special Air Service, I usually feel unwanted in my own unit. He cocked his head at the disdaining scientist. These gits have nothing on a self-righteous English troop leader. Bloody ball bags, the lot of them. The cafeteria line crept forward, and the 2 military special operators sidled ahead. Placing his tray against Baker's, Craig shoved the man's lunch farther along the rail. The Australian soldier looked down. His appraising gaze fell on Craig's dessert plate. Well, Staff Sergeant Craig Carmichael of the Special Air Service. Pausing dramatically, he made a show of pointing the flatware clutched in his hand at Craig's scone-topped peach cobbler. That looks delicious. Then the man seemed to lose his ever-loving mind, extending a finger toward the blessed treat. Craig slapped away the hand. Keep your kangaroo diddling dick skinners away from my grub, mate. Baker gave him a sideways grin and then, arriving at the front of the line, swept his ID card across the scanner. The device loosed a celebratory tone. Picking up his tray, he stepped aside. What do you reckon all this is about, anyway? I'm fucked if I can, Craig said as he scanned his ID. He hoisted his tray. They walked toward an empty booth along the back wall. Shrugging, he raised his meal appraisingly. But I'll enjoy the assignment while I can. It's a damn sight better than another tour in the sandbox. Yeah, mate, if I never have to babysit another group of wet behind-the-ear ab initio wannabe commandos, it'll be too soon. Those wankers would just as soon stick a scimitar in your back as follow your instructions. Not been my experience, Craig said. Not always, anyway. Some of the best soldiers I've worked with came from in-country. A scientist in a white lab coat walked past their table. She gave Baker a long, sour look. Then she regarded Craig with a smile. He had seen her around a couple of times. Like him, she was tall. A nice, purebred filly he'd fancy test driving. And judging by the look she was currently giving him, he doubted she would spit the bit. Looking at Baker, he saw the man staring back at him, grimacing as if he'd bitten into a lemon. Oh, for fuck's sake. And here's me thinking she didn't like the quick reaction force. Turns out she just doesn't like Aussies. I think you might be right. She certainly doesn't seem averse to the presence of this member of the QRF, Craig said through a grin while hitching a thumb at himself. But I don't think it's all Aussies, just the short, fat, bald ones. Bugger that. He pulled off his hat, revealing his glossy chrome dome. Some of us have beautiful heads. The rest of you wankers have to cover yours with hair. Then the stout man patted his rigid belly. There's no fat under this bonnet, and I'm taller than most. In bed, anyway. The two of them laughed uproariously, garnering them a few additional, less than affectionate sneers. While they hurriedly consumed their meals, Craig noticed others casting annoyed glances in their direction. He understood. The presence of the two special operators in their digital camouflage uniforms stood at odds with the facility's laboratory environment. Their M4 carbines, with underslung grenade launchers, worsened the visual disconnect. The military weapons painted a jarring contrast, standing out starkly in the Super Collider's sterile atmosphere. Baker paused between bites. I still don't understand why we have a multinational quick reaction force based here at CERN. I mean, what the bloody hell are we guarding these nerds against? The captain seems to ken. Craig shoveled in another bite and spoke through his food. But that's been pretty tight-lipped. You got all right, Baker said through a mouthful of mash. Speaking of the captain, he gestured at Craig's watch. How much time we got? 5 minutes, he answered, not bothering to check his watch. He had a finely tuned inner timepiece. Whether catching a helicopter evac or the 5 o'clock movie, his mental clock had never failed him. Eat up. We need to get back to the labyrinth, he added, referring to the complex of cubicles that constituted their base of operations. Baker nodded as he continued eating. They finished their meals and wolfed down their desserts, smacking lips and clanking forks, earning themselves another wave of leers. A few moments later, they deposited their empty trays and walked toward their quarters, although to call them quarters might be stretching the meaning of the word. The base of operations was more like a hangar. Their hosts had been kind enough to give them cubicles set within a sizable warehouse-type facility. Craig hadn't known much about CERN, but he'd learned this facility sat atop the Atlas experiment. A large circular hole adorned the center of the building's floor. A metallic grid filled the top of the cavernous shaft, breached only by a stairwell leading down into the collider's subterranean depths. Craig had discovered that the shaft adjacent to the labyrinth of cubicles had initially provided access through which the construction crews had lowered the equipment and tools they'd used to build the super collider. They had also lowered Atlas's largest pieces down the expansive vertical cavern. What do you think? Sergeant Baker asked, pulling Craig from his thoughts. What are badass SAS special operators like ourselves doing guarding a bunch of lab coat bedecked lassies? What are we protecting them from? Al-Qaeda? He shook his head. In our munitions. What the bloody hell is up with that? He patted the side of his rifle. I'm pretty sure these depleted uranium sabo darts would punch through a tank. His face twisted. I mean, what on earth are they expecting? I doubt it's terrorists, Craig said. But even if it was, you're right. This is serious overkill. He patted the double-drum Beta CMAG that hung beneath the breech of his M4 rifle. Durka 6 ain't gonna roll up in a BMP, much less a tank. He's going to run in, shouting some nonsense and spraying bullets, or blow himself up, or some such. Exactly, mate. Frowning, he shook his head as he looked at the twin coffee can-sized drums hanging from his own M4. The contraption held 100 depleted uranium rounds. These heavy-ass DU rounds are seriously overkill. I'm getting sick and tired of carting around all this weight. Craig shrugged. Whatever the target is, it must be hardened because you're right about those rounds. It'd be a bloody war crime to fire it at a person. The actual darts are tiny, not much bigger than a finishing nail. The entry hole would be barely visible, but a depleted uranium sabo leaving your body at 1,500 meters a second would suck your arsehole right out the exit wound. Ha! A human-sized anal prolapse, Baker agreed through a chuckle. Then he turned a hoisted eyebrow toward Craig. Maybe that's what happened. Maybe someone already hit the collider. You mean the power supply problem they had? Yeah. Seems odd that the place lost all of its electricity just a month ago. They've been working on it day and night ever since. Craig shook his head. No, I heard that had something to do with someone hitting the big red button. Big red button? You mean like an easy button, mate? He shrugged. I have no idea what it looks like, but word is someone activated the emergency disconnect last month. It physically cut every power line in the ring's 17-mile circumference. Why on earth would anyone do that? You answer that question, and I'll tell you why they deployed an international quick reaction force here. They approached the double steel doors that led to the warehouse that served as their base of operations. Baker reared back and kicked the lock bar. As his boot made contact, knocking the door open, a loud bang echoed through the facility. "Geez, Baker, you sure someone didn't piss in your post, Toasties?" From beneath a puckered forehead, the Aussie gaped at the now open double doors. "That wasn't me, mate. I didn't kick it that hard." "No worries. Everything echoes loudly in this place." Craig tugged at the man's sleeve as the door began to swing shut. "Come on. Can't let your grand entrance go to waste." "Whatever." As they emerged into the facility, Baker pointed into the air, indicating the large structure's ceiling. Dust was falling from it. "Told you it wasn't me. Looks like someone's working on the roof." Both men stopped in their tracks as 4 additional booms shook the building, each as loud as the one they'd heard when Baker had kicked the door. The ceiling rocked visibly, launching another cascade of dust. Craig exchanged a glance with Baker, then both men broke into a run, heading for their base of operations, a base lying directly beneath the now visibly sagging ceiling. Chapter 2. As Craig rounded the final corner, the sound of shrieking metal came from above. Ahead, Captain Laurent came flying out of the labyrinth with the remainder of the quick reaction force following close behind her. Seeing Craig looking up, she spun on her heels. Trotting backward now, the captain raised the muzzle of her HK-416 and pointed it at the visibly trembling section of roofing. Using hand signals, she silently ordered the troops behind her into a semicircle. Then the French Special Forces captain pointed at Craig and Baker and gestured to the near side of the formation, ordering them into position next to her. Craig nodded. He and Baker kept their M4s trained on the ceiling as the two of them moved to shore up the right side of the semicircular formation. Standing next to Captain Laurent, Craig leaned in and spoke under his breath. "What the bloody hell is happening, Captain?" She shook her head as she continued to stare up the facility's high roof. "I have no idea," she replied, her French accent clipping the words. "Maybe nothing, but they are supposed to warn us if they are doing any work up there." She dragged her gaze from the sight of the still shuddering ceiling and gave him a meaningful look. "I received no such warning." A new sound blared from above. Wincing, Craig and the captain looked up. The squealing wail of shredding metal pierced the air. Dozens of shiny metallic spikes slammed into view as they penetrated the roof. Craig took an involuntary backward step. "What the holy fuck is that?" Wriggling and writhing, the spikes sawed through the roof, slicing through the sheet metal and structural members like a shark shredding a newspaper. Baker aimed his gun at the moving spikes. "Hell if I know, mate, but if that's just an overzealous roofing crew," his index finger slid into position over the trigger. "They had better cut that shit out, or their day is about to go south in a big fucking way." The large circular section of roof bowed further downward. The thrashing spikes continued to oscillate. Then they sliced through the last structural member, cutting both ends of it simultaneously. The entire assembly fell 20 meters and crashed to the floor, crushing the base camp's labyrinth of cubicles beneath it. A ring of dust raced outward from the point of impact and quickly filled the large hangar-like facility. Having already donned his goggles, Craig swiped the dust away as he continued to aim his rifle at the jagged hole in the roof. No commandos manifested in the opening. No ropes fell into view. Only the too bright light of midday summer sun blazed down through the aperture. Beside him, Baker suddenly flinched. "Crikey!" He yanked his weapon down to aim at something in front of them. Jittering rays of sunlight danced through the dust, reflecting off obscured surfaces. Shifting his M4 to also aim into the swirling mass, Craig stood transfixed as he glimpsed gleaming metal through the thinning particulates. Then a huge, articulated golden machine resolved from the haze as if born from the dust itself. Blinking, unable to accept the information streaming into his visual cortex, Craig gaped at the collection of massive mechanical monstrosities standing atop the ruined section of collapsed roof. All gleaming metal and sharp angles, the things were as big as horses. Each had multiple legs, but it was their massive heads sporting insectile, razor-sharp mandibles that had him stunned into inaction. One of the beasts stared right at Craig. It spat out a chunk of angle iron. The shredded structural beam clattered across the floor, rupturing the relative silence. Craig flinched. His eyes narrowed. "Bugger that!" Flipping his weapon's fire selector switch to burst, he squeezed the trigger. A trio of depleted uranium darts burped from his M4 and burned into the head of the grinning machine. The thing withered and collapsed. "Fire! Fire! Fire!" Captain Laurent yelled. She shot one of the machines. The 3-round burst stitched a line of grooves into the carapace of the mechanical monster. But the thing continued to advance. It lunged at her. "Sacre bleu!" Laurent swore as she leaped back. Adjusting her aim, she fired into the head of the beast. 2 of the rounds ricocheted, but the third penetrated, and the caterpillar-looking machine collapsed. The entire squad opened fire. Not all of the rounds they shot inflicted damage. Some of them simply ricocheted off, leaving gouges in the metal bodies of the aggressors. As the machines began to spread out, crawling over one another, Craig saw there were dozens of the massive robots. He wondered how the roof hadn't collapsed the instant the big-ass bastards had landed on it. Where in the hell had these things come from, anyway? He hadn't heard any helicopters, and it would have taken a lot more than one to deposit these things up there. Even as the questions raced through Craig's mind, the remaining robots shifted in unison. They moved as one toward the shaft that led down to Atlas. "We have to stop them from getting to the collider," shouted Captain Laurent. She pressed 2 fingers to her throat microphone. "CERN Ops, this is Overwatch. Shut it down! Shut it down! Kill the power now!" Nothing but static. It sounded as if someone was jamming the frequency. Comprehension slammed home. This was why the powers that be had stationed a quick reaction force here. Someone had known these things might come. But where in the hell had they come from? Who could have made them? Was it the Russians? No, that couldn't be it. Yuri was a sergeant in the Russian Spetsnaz. Even now the man was firing on the robots. Craig yanked the muzzle of his M4 to the right. In rapid succession, he triggered a quartet of 3-round bursts into the head of another of the surging machines. The metallic gourd split in half, rupturing under the fusillade. The thing finally dropped, collapsing to the white concrete floor. Moving under fire, the churning mass of machines reached the top of the shaft and began to shred the steel grate that capped it. Aiming at the nearest of the robots, Craig fired another trio of depleted uranium sabot rounds at its head. Beside him, Baker shot at the articulated bot next to it. He blinked and flinched as short, narrow beams of bright light flickered in the air around the machines, and then nothing. Not even a scratch marred the skin of the robots they'd targeted. Had the rounds vanished? None of the darts he and Baker fired had found their mark. Craig shot again with the same results. Light danced around the machine, and none of the DU sabot darts reached their target. Baker fired once more, and Craig saw the source of the beams. The light was coming from a small glass dome under the head of each robot. Shifting his aim, Craig fired, intending to shatter the glass. Again the light flickered, and the rounds vanished, leaving not so much as a scratch on the apparent lens. He saw Captain Laurent shaking her head. "These things are not supposed to have that capability." "White," Baker said, confusion twisting his features. He leaned forward and looked across Craig, staring at the French officer. "You knew about these." A wider beam of white light shot from the lens under the caterpillar-like machine's chin. Narrowly missing Craig, the ray washed across Baker. The man vanished mid-word. Chapter 3. Everyone but the captain jumped back. "Keep shooting," she shouted, waving them forward. "We must overwhelm their defenses." Raising her Heckler & Koch HK-416 again, she opened fire. The German-made variant of the M4 carbine jittered in her hands as it released a barrage of sabot darts. The metal grate under the mass of machines began to squeal beneath the weight of the dozen remaining caterpillar bots. Then it collapsed, and all of them fell out of sight. Craig looked at the point where Baker had stood a moment before. A pair of boot-shaped voids remained in the field of brass casings that littered the floor. Dragging his eyes from the image, he ran up to the edge of the shaft and looked down. The entire assembly had come to rest on the next floor, having fallen only 3 or 4 meters. Several of them began to scramble down the side of the shaft, their pincer-like claws digging into the metallic walls. Each of the squad aimed down and fired on the descending robots. Hundreds of shots rang out. Few, if any, of the rounds found their targets as hundreds of light beams flickered up the shaft. Another team member vanished. Lieutenant Fay, a U.S. Navy SEAL, disappeared as he leaned over to fire down on a descending robot. "Hit him with a mix of saber rounds and grenades," Captain Laurent yelled. "We need to overwhelm their defenses." Craig moved his trigger finger to the grenade launcher. He gave the captain a sideways glance. "What about the collider and the scientists down there?" "Screw the scientists. They're part of the problem. They didn't want to believe this could happen." She fired a grenade down the hole, but a flash of light swallowed the round before it could reach its target. The French officer glanced at Craig. "If we are lucky, we will take out the collider too." She dipped her head, nodding down the shaft toward the descending robots. "If we let them take control of the collider, we will lose a lot more than a few scientists." As Craig struggled to comprehend what she was saying, he fired a grenade toward one of the caterpillar bots descending the far side of the shaft. The thing was already 30 meters below the second deck. After loosing the grenade, he immediately swapped to fully automatic and sent a 10-round burst of depleted uranium sable rounds. The grenade vanished in a flicker of light, but 2 of the 3 hypervelocity darts ripped through the torso of the crawling machine. It broke into pieces and fell out of sight. Before he could celebrate, a beam of light arced up from the back of another of the machines. It washed over a South African special operator, causing the woman to vanish. Then it swept toward Craig. He ducked sideways, just as the light flickered past where his head had been a moment before. Scanning the walls of the shaft, Craig looked for a means to give chase. The bastards were getting away. Shaking his head, he growled through clenched teeth. Shit! There's nothing, no way to follow them down. The robots took out the entire stairwell and grate. The squad had lengths of rope back at the base, but they now sat crushed beneath the roof's collapsed section. He looked around, searching for something they could use to lower themselves down the shaft. Shit, still nothing. There were plenty of wires strewn throughout the wrecked assemblies and equipment, but nothing long enough to get them anywhere close to the bottom of the long vertical tunnel. Captain Laurent shouted and waved for Craig and the remaining members of the Quick Reaction Force to follow her. She ran toward a door on the left. Head for the stairwell. We can't let them get to Atlas. She pressed a pair of fingers to her throat mic and activated her radio again. Cern Ops, this is Overwatch. Why is the power still on? As she reached the door and threw it open, she shook her head. No one is answering. Craig tapped his ear. I didn't hear you over the radio. I don't think you're transmitting. Holding the door open, Captain Laurent waved them through. She activated her radio again. Operations, this is Overwatch. I say again, cut the power. Now, now, now. Still can I hear you. You're no getting through. Craig ran past her and headed down the stairs, shouting over his shoulder. Sounds like someone is jamming the frequency. The captain cursed in French. Craig heard her and the rest of the QRF squad hot on his heels as he sprinted down the stairs. He encountered a few scientists running in the other direction, coming up the stairwell while he and the rest of the troops careened down it. Amazingly, the lab coat bedecked men and women no longer appeared offended by the presence of armed military personnel. Several flights later, Craig finally reached the bottom of the stairwell. After a quick scan of the area beyond, he stormed through the doors, took up a defensive position, and then waved in the squad's remaining 5 members. They had entered a corridor that looked like something you'd see in a hospital. Immediately, he registered a loud hum that seemed to be rising in intensity, and pointed toward one end of the corridor. That way! Craig started running in the indicated direction. Using bounding Overwatch maneuvers, he and the rest of the squad leapfrogged down the corridor. Running beside him, her carbine at the ready, Laurent pointed ahead. Take a left at the second corridor. Just as they reached the indicated passageway, a scientist in a white lab coat backed out of it. Sliding to a stop, Craig narrowly avoided bowling over the man. The scientist turned wide eyes toward him. He spoke with a distinctly American accent. They're trying to do it. Again. What are they trying to do, Mr. Craig read the name tag on the man's coat. Sampson. The man blinked and then set his jaw. Dr. Sampson. I don't give 2 rat's asses about your title right now, Sampson. What are you talking about? Craig paused and looked around. The rest of the group was standing around him. Captain Laurent looked ready to move on, but she obviously valued the intel this doctor might supply. Sampson blinked and then slowly nodded. It's just like in the video they sent us, but the machines are different this time. Confused, Craig looked at Captain Laurent and saw her nodding. Craig spun toward her. What the hell have you been keeping from us, Captain? He thrust a finger toward the hallway. And what the bloody hell are those things? We call them caterpillars. Command didn't think the Nex would find us, so they locked the whole thing under a lid of secrecy. Nex? What are you talking about? Holding up a hand, Laurent shook her head. No time to explain. She pointed to the ceiling. Hear that growing hum? That is the collider ramping up. And it's not us doing it. It's the caterpillars. We have to take out those robots before they can finish what they're doing. Otherwise, things are going to get much, much worse. Pausing, she looked at Sampson. Wait. Why did you not cut the power? They were on top of us before we knew what was happening. The captain narrowed her eyes. Surely you had enough time to hit the emergency kill switch. Craig realized she must be referring to the big red button he and Baker had spoken about earlier. All the color drained from the American's face. Apparently, the thought of pressing that button had scared him worse than the attacking robots. Confirming Craig's suspicions, the man said, "The last person that did that lost his career." Laurent's eyes flared. "We all stand to lose a lot more than our careers, Doctor." She paused and looked down the corridor. "Where are the caterpillars now?" "There's at least one in the control room." He raised an arm and pointed ahead. "The rest of the robots are on this side of the door, facing outward like they're guarding the entrance. I barely made it out of there alive." His eyes darkened. "I don't think anyone else did." Captain Laurent held her hand out like a blade and pointed it down the corridor. "The control room is down the first hallway on your right. Move it." Staying low and keeping his weapon pointed ahead, Craig hurried in the indicated direction. He winced as his boots clanged on the hollow subfloor, momentarily eclipsing the noise of the building energies. The echoing clatter would make it impossible to sneak up on the robots. He reached the adjoining corridor and stopped short. Glancing back, he saw Captain Laurent following with the American scientist in tow. The man looked none too happy to be coming with them. Returning his attention ahead, Craig focused on the large, curved mirror hanging above the T-shaped intersection. In the fish-eyed, wide-angle image, he saw several of the large caterpillars. They lined the wall at the far end of the corridor. He looked back at Captain Laurent and shook his head. "It's no good," he whispered. "If their light beams can snatch a high-velocity sable dart out of the air, we don't stand a chance. The instant one of us shows ourselves, the caterpillars will hit us with that light." The captain looked at the scientist. "Is there another way around?" Samson shook his head. "Only through the actual Atlas detector facility, but if you go that way, you'll be killed by the radiation." Craig looked up into the curved surface of the mirror again. The robots didn't seem interested in pursuing them. If he could see them, they could surely see him too, but they held their post. In the wide-angle view, he saw sections of the floor buckling under the metallic legs of the caterpillars. The sight reminded him of the hollow sound his boots made when he'd advanced to this position. He turned and looked at the scientist. "What's under these floors? Is there a passageway?" "Yes, we pump cold air in there. It keeps the electronics and cabling from overheating." Captain Laurent nodded her understanding. "Simpson, is there sufficient room for a person to crawl around down there?" "A couple of people could probably get through, and there's nothing between here and the control room." She started to look away from the scientist, then her gaze snapped back to his face. She regarded the man through narrowed lids. "Are you the Simpson that was there when it happened?" The American's eyes drifted left and up. He started to shake his head, but then nodded. His shoulders sagged. "Yes, I was there." Captain Laurent released a string of French curse words, finishing with "Idiot." Turning from the man, she pointed to the other members of the squad. "You four, keep the enemy engaged. Stay here where they can see you." She gestured at Craig and herself and then pointed a thumb over her shoulder, indicating the direction from which they had come. "We'll fall back, get out of sight of this mirror, and then ingress via the crawl space." Everyone nodded their understanding. Craig led the way back down the corridor. All the while, the collider's hum continued to rise, setting his teeth on edge. Somehow it seemed to have taken on an evil undertone, as if demons from hell were intent on crossing into the facility's subterranean depths. The captain followed close on Craig's heels, dragging the scientist by the now soot-smudged lapel of his white lab coat. Reaching the next intersection, Craig checked and then darted around the corner. After verifying it remained clear, he waved the captain and her unwilling ward forward. They joined him in the main corridor. Craig glanced back, ensuring they had passed out of the convex mirror's field of view. Then he dropped to a knee and extracted his Fairbairn Sykes fighting knife. Flipping it to point the blade down, he glimpsed his grandfather's initials, GSD, carved into the handle. From fighting Germans in North Africa to battling alien robots beneath Geneva, if you could only talk, Craig thought. He wedged the FS knife's sharp point into the thin line between the panels and began to pry at the floor. A grunt came from behind him. Turning, Craig saw Laurent pinning a struggling Samson to the wall. She patted her holstered sidearm threateningly. "You wait right here." Not pausing for a reply, she dropped to a knee across from Craig and began to work on the panel as well. A moment later, they raised one side of it and slid it out of the frame. The space visible through the opening was a meter deep and dark. The French captain stood and grabbed Samson. She dragged the scientist toward the opening. "You're coming with us." "What?" The man's eyes flew wide, and his legs went rigid. "You don't need my oof!" Captain Laurent punched him in the gut, and then stuffed the doubled-over man into the hole. She descended behind the scientist and shoved him aside. Then she waved Craig into the crawl space. He checked both ends of the corridor and then followed her. Careful not to make any noise, he lowered himself through the opening. The captain pointed over Craig's shoulder and whispered, "It's about 20 meters that way." Then she glared at the scientist. "You stay behind us." He rubbed his abdomen, a plaintive look on his face. "Why am I coming?" "Because, once we take out the robots, we are going to need you to help shut down the collider." I... Still holding her carbine in one hand, she patted her holstered pistol with the other. "You'll follow us, or so help me, I will shoot you myself." The man's mouth clicked shut. Chapter 4. Craig again verified a chambered round and then turned and crawled into the dark underbelly of the facility. His eyes quickly adapted to the low light conditions. Red and green points of LED light stared from every direction, some unblinkingly, others flickering and strobing manically. It looked as if thousands of electrified bats had taken refuge in the meter-tall crawl space. Shaking the thought from his head, he continued deeper into the facility. Several times he had to negotiate spans of cabling, but he found plenty of room as long as he kept his rifle from getting tangled. A few moments later, he saw several floor panels bowing down to his left. The section creaked under the weight of the caterpillars guarding the outside of the control room. Looking back, he placed his finger to his lips and then pointed. Both the captain and the scientist nodded. Continuing to advance, he soon came to a wide area with no cables. He estimated they had arrived beneath the center of the room beyond the wall, the control room Samson and Laurent had discussed. Captain Laurent motioned for the scientist to hold position. Then she crawled up next to Craig. After pointing 2 fingers at his own eyes, Craig gestured toward another sagging section of flooring. It hung a couple of meters ahead of them. It rocked visibly under the weight of the caterpillar that had taken up station within the control room. Laurent shifted her gaze from the sagging panel and then back to the one overhead. Then she pointed at herself and then at the floor directly above them. She pumped a thumb and mouthed, "I'm going up. Cover me." He slid out of her way and then pointed his M4 at the area just above the control room's drooping floor, ready to fire at the first sign the caterpillar above it had noticed the captain. Working silently, Laurent released the panel directly over her head and slowly eased it up. Craig held his breath as he caressed the trigger of his weapon with his index finger. The French commando slowly raised her head. A wedge of white light illuminated her eyes. She looked left and right. Then she swallowed hard and glanced at Craig. She pointed ahead and then held up one finger. Just as Samson had said, there was only one bogey in the room. Again, she motioned for the scientist to hold position. Afterwards, she signaled to Craig that she was going up. She pointed to herself and then in the direction of the bogey. Then she pointed at Craig and gestured toward the floor beneath the line of caterpillar robots posted outside the control room. He understood immediately. She wanted the 2 of them to attack both positions simultaneously. He was to fire through the floor, hitting all the caterpillars guarding the entrance while she took out their apparent leader. The hum of the collider's rising power increased to painful levels. The captain looked at Craig and mouthed, "On 3." He bobbed his head and then rolled onto his back. Taking care not to bump the ends of his rifle into the low crawl space's floor or ceiling, he aimed toward the sagging panel just as he'd done earlier and ensured the weapon's sightline wasn't pointing toward the troops in the T intersection beyond the caterpillars. Craig felt his heart pounding in his chest as he remembered how fast these things moved. The 2 of them had to do this simultaneously or else they would all be dead. Lying flat on his back, with his head tilted up, he watched the captain slowly extend the muzzle of her HK-416 through the opening and aim it at the back of the lead robot. Then she looked back at Craig and held up a finger. He nodded and eased his own finger to the trigger of his M4. Captain Laurent extended a second digit. Craig swallowed. With his thumb, he verified the switch of his rifle was still in full auto, aka spray and pray. Laurent extended the final finger. Craig squeezed the trigger and swept the weapon's muzzle left and right, raking it across the unseen line of robots as he continued to aim just above the line of sagging floor panels. At the same time, he heard a 3-round burst erupt from the captain's rifle. The floor beyond his feet collapsed, dropping the shattered remnants of the remaining caterpillar bots. The forward half of one of them continued thrashing. A quick double tap from Craig's M4 launched a pair of DU darts into the thing's head, and then it too fell silent. Turning back toward the captain, he saw her climbing up through the hole in the floor. Her French accented voice drifted down through it. Target neutralized. Craig keyed his radio. Bravo team, we got him. How do you read? Fucking hell, shouted an Australian accented voice. That's bloody good to hear, mate. Apparently, the now destroyed bots had been jamming the radios. Hearing the Aussie accent brought memories of Baker back to the forefront. Grrr, growling through clenched teeth, Craig repeatedly slammed the heel of a boot into one of the inert robots. Ah, you bastard! Metal shitehouse! Staff Sergeant Carmichael, are you there? Staff Sergeant Carmichael, are you there? Craig shook his head. Releasing a sigh, he keyed the microphone. Yeah, I'm here. Sweep the facility. Make sure there are no other targets. After the special operators in the hallway acknowledged his call, he added, Clear the rooms and corridors, but if you encounter anything else, what's your field of fire? Don't hit us, you kin? Understood, Sergeant. Wilco. Good. Now fuck off. Report back when you're done. The Aussie acknowledged Craig's orders with a double click of his radio's transmit key. Sergeant Carmichael, Captain Laurent shouted from the control room. Get your ass up here. Bring the scientists. The collider's power is still rising. Motioning for Samson to follow him, Craig climbed up and joined Captain Laurent in the control room. She had her rifle trained on the motionless and shattered body of the robot. The thing was huge, easily the size of a tractor. Much of the room lay in ruins, but the electronics and control console it had been using remained intact. A large window filled one wall of the control room. The captain cast a nervous glance through it, eyeing the large machinery that filled the facility beyond the glass. Craig recognized it as the iconic Atlas experiment. Dragging his eyes from the giant machine's expansive plumbing, Craig stepped around the fallen caterpillar, making sure to keep his distance. Captain Laurent hammered the butt of her rifle into a small appendage that extended from the alien robot. The blow yanked the device from the port on the front of the computer terminal. Still attached to the inanimate robot, the appendage collapsed to the floor. Looking down, Craig saw that the narrow tip of an apparent USB-C plug protruded from the end of the enemy robot's attachment. Captain Laurent shook her head, releasing a string of French curse words again. She looked at Craig, mounting fear evident on her face. The power is still building. We have to shut it down. She leaned over the console and raised a plastic cover. Craig saw something red beneath it. He realized it must be the emergency disconnect he'd heard about. Something crashed behind Craig. He and the captain spun toward it, weapons raised. Samson's wide eyes stared back at them. The floor panel he'd dislodged toppled and disappeared through the opening. Looking past them and seeing the kill switch's plastic cover raised, the scientist threw out both hands in a stop gesture. Wait! What are you doing? Laurent turned away from him and bent over the robot, reaching for the big red button. I'm cutting the power. Samson darted forward, holding out his hands. Wait! That'll physically cut all the power cables. Again! The captain looked back. Exactly, Dr. Simpson. You should have never restored the power in the first place. She pointed down at the robot. There are likely more of these on the way. The next time we may not be able to stop. The caterpillar's metal mandibles snapped upward. The woman's words cut out mid-sentence as the gleaming jaws slammed closed, bisecting Captain Laurent's outstretched torso. Fuck! Craig shouted. A truncated scream burst from Captain Laurent's lips as the machine sliced through her abdomen. The lower half of her body fell to the floor. Arterial blood sprayed over the caterpillar and shot across the room. Too late, Craig raised his rifle and emptied the last of his magazine into the base of the caterpillar's head, making sure not to hit the captain. This time the machine died, permanently. A male voice beyond the control room door shouted, Clear! Then the door flew open. The remaining 4 special operators stormed into the room, rifles raised. Craig waved them back. We're clear, but we lost Captain Laurent. They swept their eyes over the scene, following the trail of gore across the room. Then the special operators froze, staring at Laurent's upper body still clamped in the dead caterpillar's tilted jaws. The Aussie croaked an, shit. But to their credit, none of the troops looked sick or ready to bolt. Craig couldn't say the same for Samson. Turning from the asshole and the sound of his retching, Craig spun toward the big red button. He stepped across the captain's severed hips and reached across her bloody torso. As he did, her lifeless eyes seemed to stare straight at him. Groaning, he said, Sorry, Mum. He pushed past her. Then he slammed his fist down on the disconnect button. Nothing happened. The power level continued to ramp up. Shite! What is it? Shouted the Aussie. The bleeding collider is still going. What does that mean? I'll tell you later. He pointed back through the control room's door, indicating the shattered remnants of the other robots. For now, just put a few more sable rounds in the heads of each one of those bastards. Roger, Staff Sergeant. The men departed, casting uneasy glances at Captain Laurent's mangled remains. Craig looked at the captain in time to see something flash on the computer terminal beyond her. The blood spattered across the screen obscured the message. He leaned in and wiped away the gore and then read the words aloud. Power level nominal. Initiating collisions. You've got to be shitting me. Useless piece of shite. He looked back at Simpson. You wee bastard. Why is this thing no fucking working? I thought this big goddamn easy button was supposed to shut it off. All color had drained from the scientist's face. Wiping vomit from his mouth with the back of a hand, he continued to gape at Captain Laurent's bisected body. Samson! Craig raised his rifle and pointed it at the man's head. Help me shut this damn thing down or I'll punch a sable dart through your skull, you worthless shite bag. The doctor blinked and his eyes shifted to the muzzle of Craig's rifle. 3. He stammered and then shook his head. You have to hit the button 3 times. Lowering his weapon, Craig spun back to the button. In rapid-fire succession, he slammed his fist down on the button once, twice, 3 times. The computer screen went black, and the sound of building electrical energy fell away. Then the overhead lights died. That's the end of today's installment. The next episode of The Multiverse will pick up with Chapter 5, where we'll catch up with Vaughn and Angela and the rest of our heroes from Amplitude, and we'll find out what they've been up to. Just a quick reminder, the last 3 books of my Dimension Space universe, Magnitude, Fortitude, and soon Infinitude, are exclusive to Audible. I can't stream them here on YouTube, so if you'd rather listen to R.C. Bray's excellent narration of Magnitude, click here. Also, you'll be able to find a link to Magnitude in the description. That concludes today's episode of The Multiverse. Be sure to subscribe and click the bell to get notified when the next installment is released. Thanks. Bye.